very final session of the forum. My name is Kwangjo Kim. I'm the director of UNESCO Bangkok. Before I joined UNESCO, I was working for the government of Korea. My last post in the government of Korea was Deputy Minister for Education and Human Resources Development. I'm very pleased and honored to lead this final session of the forum. And the issue or agenda for this session is policy directions for fostering future talent aimed at maximizing the potential for national growth. I don't know what it means. It's a very lengthy title, but in a nutshell, I suppose we are asked to speak about the kind of directions that we can provide to decision makers of all kinds, not just policymakers, but also decision makers working at institutional level and also in the business sector. Up to this point, we have heard and learned a lot about change, about talent, creativity, and also about globalization and about the future. If I may to point out 3 to 4 keywords of this forum, they may be change, they may be future, global, and creativity or talent. Having said that, in this particular session, again, as I proposed, it would be good for us to reflect on what you have heard up to this point and to think about the directions that we should be heading. In so doing, I would like to propose one key question. The question is, again, what might be sensible ways to foster the kind of skilled human resources that are required in the ever-changing global knowledge economy in the future? In other words, what kind of advice can we provide to various decision makers to develop, retain, and upgrade their talent or skill pool? We now have very distinguished speakers and guests. Instead of me introducing who they are, I would like to invite each and every speaker and discussant to introduce themselves, and then I will talk about the organization of the session. I will give 1 minute to each speaker and discussant, starting from Mr. Eduardo Velez from World Bank, who is Education Sector Manager for Asia and the Pacific. Eduardo?
I never knew what I wanted to do with my life. So I spent 12 years studying at the university. My first field of study was engineering. I went to work for Exxon. It was too bureaucratic for me. I changed career. I got a PhD in statistics, and I ended up in the bank, in the World Bank. I married my basic education sweetheart. I have 2 daughters and 1 granddaughter. I had published 9 books and almost 100 articles in professional journals of research reports. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Eduardo. You don't look like a grandfather. Next, Mr. Eddie Ong from Hong Kong.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Couple of points about me. First, I spent the first 25 years working for multinational corporations in telecom, in high tech, particularly in the iBank sector. And then the last 5 years, spent a lot of time volunteering board level at the educational institutions. So, you know, and trying to combine the two, focusing on the human capital management side. I have a passion on this one, and the world traveling around is basically my home. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ong. The next is Dr. Bernard Hugonio from OECD, Deputy Director for Education in OECD.
Thank you. Just to stay in the same line as Eduardo, my main concern when I was young, still is, was to understand this word, what this word is about. So I thought that the best way would be to learn about economics and political philosophy. Then I've been choosing to work in an international organization, trying to work for the public good, international public good, and I've been working for the past 30 years at the OECD, where I've been dealing with macroeconomics, international economics, multinational enterprises, public finance, regional development, and last but not least, education. I'm very pleased to be with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Hugonia. Next is Professor Geo Lee from KDI, School of Public Policy.
Thank you, Chairman. I joined the government and have been working for 5 years. And I pursued some PhD in economics. And then I joined the World Bank and then stayed some 26 years and came back to Korea. And I'm teaching at the KDI School and the Seoul National University. Thank you.
Professor Lee, on top of these 4 distinguished speakers and discussants, we have very distinguished guests from this particular region. Now let me invite Mr. Ramon Bacani from Philippines, who is the Undersecretary, Department of Education, or Minister of Education in the Philippines.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Ramon Bacani. I'm the Undersecretary in the Philippines Department of Education. I've been with the department for the past 20 years. I previously worked in the planning and budget agencies of the Philippine government. My background is in engineering, development economics, and I think I should also say educational planning. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bacani. Last but not least, let me introduce His Excellency Minister of Education in Lao PDR, Mr. Magnomek. Yeah. I'm sorry. Oh, as you heard, we have very good combination of speakers and discussants. The 2 distinguished guests from international organizations representing World Bank and OECD, and we have one renowned professor from academia, and also high official from national government, and one very popular speaker in the private sector from Hong Kong. So for the next hour and a half, I would like to ask 2 speakers to present their cases in 20 minutes. Then I will invite discussants to share their views on the presentation for 5 minutes or so. So this will give us the remaining 15-20 minutes for debate and discussions, an exchange of ideas between the floor and the panel. So having this in mind, if you all agree, I would like to invite Mr. Eduardo Velez to present the case from World Bank. Mr. Eduardo Velez.
Oh, it's okay? Oh, I'm going to present today the World Bank policy framework for higher education. And as Manny was saying yesterday, this is going to be the last presentation, not only of the last day, but the last presentation of the whole event. So Eddie and I will have a big challenge to keep you awake and interested in the topic that we have presented. And the important thing to keep in mind is that, as many people have said during this past couple of days, knowledge has become a fundamental component of economic and social development. And we have a clear consensus that the ability of a society to produce, select, adapt, and commercialize knowledge is critical for sustained economic growth and improving living standards. Knowledge has become a fundamental component and this is the most critical element that I have digested from the couple of days of discussions and presentations. In this general context, tertiary education plays a very important role to build the human capital needed to provide or to create an efficient system of innovation. And at the same time, it also helps with building a country that will be able to compete in the global economy. And the higher education does that by developing a skilled, productive, and flexible labor force, and also by applying and creating new knowledge. The availability of qualified professionals and technicians and the application of advanced knowledge are also key in helping developing countries achieve the Millennium Development Goals and to build the institutional capacity that is essential to reduce poverty. About 20 years ago in the bank, probably you would have not heard these same sentences I'm reading here today. We were focusing more on basic education as the priority for countries to develop, and in a sense, we were forgetting the relevance of higher education to achieve the same objectives. And it's important to invest in higher education because there are many social benefits from it. It's critical to have a mass of well-informed citizens who understand and work for democratic practices. It's also important to create a large pool of capable business people who can run more efficient business and ultimately expand the economic pie. It's important to have good leaders who can understand how the local and the global get together. And it's also important to develop the people, scientists and technicians who can play key roles in adapting technology and in integrating developed world practices into our societies, agricultural, industrial, and educational systems. There are other social benefits for tertiary education that are reflected in lower levels of employment, lower level of crimes and poverty, great civic participation, and as I said, a well-informed electorate. The added value of tertiary education in developing countries, therefore, should not be underestimated. There are a lot of spillovers effect that some people are trying to measure at this time. In this content, then, what is the future of higher education? I have 5 messages that I want to share with you today. One is that social and economic progress is achieved principally through the advancement and application of knowledge. Manny presented yesterday this graph contrasting, I believe, Korea and Mexico. I'm bringing this again to make the point once again. Knowledge is critical, and the difference between the ones who achieved versus the ones who remain is explained mostly by access and production of knowledge. The case of the second message I'm making is that tertiary education is necessary to create, disseminate, and apply knowledge. It's important to achieve the Millennium Development Goals and to build local capacity, some of the biggest constraints our clients have to develop. So it is important to increase productivity. somebody mentioned, Chancellor Schroeder, I believe, was the one who was linking the topic of education and economic development and global environment. Let me bring you an example of what I believe he meant. In the case of global environment, we are witnessing more and more the case of disasters, natural disasters. In the Philippines in the last month, they were victims of 4 typhoons in a row. There have been tsunamis, earthquakes. So tertiary education is critical to disaster preparedness. We need to make sure that we understand what is going on, seismology, volcanology, climatology, as topics of studies at higher education are more relevant today than ever. It is important then to understand global issues. Main message number 3 is that tertiary education systems in most developing countries and in transition countries as well are not adequately prepared to play the roles I was mentioning before, and they need to change the situation. The reason why they are not ready, the systems are not ready, are the following. There are some long-standing challenges, like, for example, financial limitations. There is not enough resources, not enough money to expand the system. As a result, and partially as a result, there is inequity in access to tertiary education. The quality and relevance of tertiary education is questionable, and they have weak system of governance and management in general. In some cases, non-existent. But there are new challenges. The new challenges have been covered in part by some of the presenters during these past couple of days. We are discussing about the need to have new education and training needs because the labor market is changing and the needs for the labor market are changing fast. So we need to have systems that produce professionals, technicians, engineers, etc., for these new needs. There is also increased competition, and there are a new set of the new providers, and you can look at this in the concept of borderless education. There is also more access, as we have discussed during these days, to new information, and communication technologies are really changing the nature of how higher education is delivered these days. In terms of changing education and training needs, the bottom line is that the system, the market needs higher skills. To have the 12-year-old graduate, the 16-year-old graduate is not enough. We need more higher skills level of education. And we also have observed that the difference in income between higher education and other levels of education is increasing, both for female and for male, and this is having an impact in why it's important to have higher education. The second element that I want to discuss in terms of changing education and training needs is the mandatory flexibility to adapt to change these days. In fact, I believe that the name of the game, according to the couple of days discussion that we have had, is that the system has to prepare people in a very flexible way to adapt to the changes that are happening and more rapidly. Manny presented this graph yesterday showing how the routine, the manual type of work is decreasing, and the market is all the time requiring more jobs that imply interaction with more complex communication, an expert system resolving problems. In medicine, there are robot doctors replacing real doctors, and in this situation, it is of concern to see the quality of education, in this case measured, for example, by PISA, shows how our clients are in a worse position than OECD countries. The quality of what we are producing in terms of education is not what the market expects to. So we need to change that challenge as well. And the third element in terms of changing education and training needs has to do with the need for continuing education, lifelong learning. You have heard many people expressing the importance of working within this framework. You have to start learning when you are a kid and you never finish learning. Even people like Professor Kiwoo Lee still are learning. And let me tell you, talking about people like Professor Kiwoo Lee, how the demographic pyramid has changed in Korea, creating new challenges. If you compare Korea with Brazil in the last 40 years, in 1916, the population pyramid was very similar. But Korea has changed tremendously, and the population is aging, as has been discussed here, and this implies new challenges, and because of that, the education system has to change, and if we are working under the assumption that you have to work with a long life learning approach, and you have to provide education and training for the people to change their skills and adapt to the market because they have to work at all their ages, the higher education university, the education institutions at higher education level will have to look as an inverted pyramid, where the traditional concept of university, the bachelor's degree, is only the base for the continuous process to education with postgraduate studies and the continuing education. And this is very important in terms of identifying the nature of what the services should be. And it's important because this implies that there are new challenges, and because of that, the market reacts, and there are new providers. Long-distance competition is a critical element. Somebody in the session before us was mentioning how people from their country were getting degrees from universities that are in other countries. The concept of franchise university is also very clear, how this has been permeating the market as new providers, the corporate universities, and again, ICT in general provides with new manners or forms to deliver education service. And this new form of competition creates situations like the one I'm going to describe. This is an article in a newspaper. It says basically, we think that a great university should have a should have a large, impressive campus. And in this case, the university says ours is as big as the world. And this is the first fully accredited online university. Basically, it means that almost from anywhere in the world where you have access to internet, you can have access to higher education service and get a valid certificate. Among the new challenges, we have mentioned that we have new education and training needs, new professional profiles. Then there is the increased competition and emergence of new type of providers, and the potential of new information and communication technology presents also opportunities. And if you are, let me compare the importance of what I just said, contrasting geography in one dimension and time in another one. If you are in a geographical location at this particular point in time, like here in this room, we can exchange, we can have a physical interaction, we can have access to printed books or journals or newspapers, and we can have access to laboratories and studios, etc. But the new technology is opening up the possibilities for accessing new forms of education. And the interesting thing is that before, the conditions were constrained to same time, same geographical location. Now you can have different time, different geographical location, and still be connected and interacting teachers and students. And this makes a different world altogether. In fact, to be a professor today, the professor, you need to be really a brave person. The fourth message is that the state has some responsibilities. These responsibilities is that the country should have an enabling environment that encourage tertiary institutions to be more innovative and responsive. And because of that, then you need to have a coherent national strategy. You need to have a vision and a clear policy framework. And you need to establish a regulatory environment and offer appropriate financial incentive to correct for some of the inefficiencies I mentioned before regarding inequity access, for example. The fifth and last message is that the World Bank can assist countries by sharing international experience and mobilizing the resources needed to improve their tertiary education systems. The role of the bank is, it has two levels. One is we can contribute financially with implementing specific developing programs, investments, but we also provide technical assistance to define and implement reforms. And also we have the responsibility to disseminate the knowledge that we have by working in many countries in the world from different angles and perspectives. We are probably the only institution that work in a large number of countries by focusing on education, health, financing, etc. And it's our responsibility to share what we have learned from there. Some of the things that we do is that we try to understand the political economy of the countries. We try to understand the position of the different stakeholders in the sector, in the level, and bring again the relevant experience. Let me finalize by telling you the kind of reforms that we are supporting and why we do it. When we have adequate knowledge of what is the issue and the priorities in the country, and we see that there is a need to change, and we see that there is the political reform, the political willingness to implement the reform, we collaborate in different ways. This is a menu of the type of things that we do. We support the governments with the diversification of the system in the context of the lifelong learning. We support science and technology investment, science, technology, and innovation reforms. We support innovation for quality and improving relevance at the sector. We support investment to improve equity in the system through mainly, but not exclusively, student loan mechanism, for example. And we need to make sure that the financing is sustainable in time. And finally, we also support the government with governance and management of the system, access to ICT, and we are, for example, now investing one third of each dollar that we lend this past year to East Asia countries was targeted to higher education, for example. And 1/5, 20 cents out of each dollar that we lend for education worldwide is focusing on education. So with this rapid description of what the bank does, I finish the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Eduardo, for your insightful and very, very informative presentation. By the way, of the 5 bullet points that you talked about, since I'm representing UNESCO in a way, we do similar thing in UNESCO, especially the last point about point number 5, helping countries. In case of World Bank, the countries are viewed as clients. That's why they call countries client countries. In case of UNESCO, countries are viewed as members. So UNESCO call countries member states. UNESCO help member states in various ways by providing technical assistance like what World Bank does, and also trying to help their upgrade their capacity in terms of addressing all these policy questions. Also, through standard setting function of UNESCO, through various conventions to protect learners and to promote student mobility across national boundaries, and so on and so forth. Thank you again for your excellent presentation. Now, let me invite Mr. Eddie Ong, and Eddie Ong will bring us about the case from Hong Kong on top of the general trend that he will discuss. Mr. Ong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a chance here to share, and I do have about 200 pages of transparencies and PowerPoints, but I don't think I have the chance to present all, so I just changed the style. Couple of bullet points first. There are a couple of things we need to remember. 5 years ago, 7 years ago, we have the financial turmoil at Asian level, and then the global turmoil and so on and so forth. A lot of other things going on, SARS and all the swine flu and so on. Every single bit is giving us unprecedented experience to go through. So the concept now is, so if you're going to train people up, we will not be talking about crisis management anymore. That's outdated. We should be training people for permanent crisis management. So just remember the first concept. The second one is, so every single bit of things we learned in the last 2-3 decades did not work out that well last 12 months. So therefore, we need to relook at all the fundamentals. Last week, I spent 2 days with another big corporation, the 5th largest in their own trade in the world, actually spending whole 2 days with the senior management, just try to learn something from the financial turmoil. I think a lot of companies are doing that. Thirdly, everything we look at, and so at the end of the day, we go back to individuals. If you look at the Asian culture, look at the Confucius education background, philosophy, start with individual, and then the family, and then the organization, then the nation. Go back to that basics as well. So everything back to individual personal basics. Time for us to relook at the rebalancing act of the body, heart, and the brain. Last 12, 18 months, you will see the whole world by countries switching a lot, with government taking a big role. Question is, should they be? We need to relook at, be careful looking at what's the role the government should be taking. Definitely new phases for Asia. Last but not the least, one critical element. We talk a lot these 2 days about human capital. There are 3 things to me is important from HR perspective. First, unlike those capital, financial capital, intellectual capital, or the franchise capital, land capital, whatever, the human capital is something you cannot own. I talk to my wife, we've been married about 30 years. I tell her, well, I own her. The moment I say it, the following week, I need to work on the instant noodles myself. So that is a very, very risky business. I will not touch it anymore. So can I own that? Second, human capital as such, if you do not provide opportunity, then actually you run a risk of appreciation or depreciation. I have seen a lot of great people joining lousy organizations with lousy managers ending up depreciating every day. This is what a waste from that perspective. Now, a little bit more, I'm sure you're aware of it. This is Asia. Eventually, with the last 12 months changes around the world, Asia pop up. Question is whether we are able to take a totally different perspective to manage our future with this new scenario. Okay, from 7% to 22%, 23% of the GDP. Of course, population-wise, we occupy about 60% of the global population, and we are contributing only 23% GDP, something we need to talk about. Keep on talking about what Asia, other than just global. Let's focus on Asia for a while. How many people in Asia? 3.7 billion. If the global is around 6.5 or even 7, at least half. So a lot of people, 2,000 odd languages, and then 37 countries. And the number of countries increasing every day. So look at it from that angle. This is the scenario. Now, I have 3 stories to tell to cut it short. The first is on personal effectiveness category I talk about. Second, a challenge in front of us about the intergenerational workforce. The third one about the education reform, using the Hong Kong one as an example. Macquarie, in terms of the personal effectiveness, this is a very interesting Australian bank. 4 years ago, only got about 4 countries in business, about $500 million profit. Ever since I joined, and we did a lot of beautiful things. Within 3 years, the profit jumped from $500 million to $1.5 billion. Number of countries from 4 to 24. What did we do right? Because when we recruit people, we just say, well, I have a 50% job spec for you. The other 50%, you create it by yourself. This is how the future human capital comes into being. No one can predict the future. No one has a crystal ball. You need to allow, with decency, room for the other party to contribute and to manage themselves. So this is a very interesting mix. The second one relates to Jpmorgan Chase, another company I've been working for. Actually, I had the luck joining the whole process of creating this organization. Jardine Fleming merger with Chase, and then with 6 months later, we love Jpmorgan. We buy out Jpmorgan, and 2 Australian banks become Jpmorgan Chase. Look at the whole scenario last 15 months. There's only 1 American bank survived with success. Every other bank, the other bank I work for is Citi. Okay, I love them still, but look at the dramatic differences. Jpmorgan Chase only winner. Why did they win? Why did they survive? One thing very simple. They focus on personal effectiveness. Everyone going in, basically, if you join Jpmorgan Chase, I'll talk to you right away. 4 categories of leadership. Strategic leadership, business leadership, important but not to the extent. The most important one, people leadership, and fundamental one, personal leadership. Personal leadership over there. We do a lot of things in terms of the ethical standard and so on. Because of this one, the bank which commit the minimum errors actually is Jpmorgan Chase, and that's why they survive. The other one is the Housing Society of Hong Kong, and at the time we got about 60 billion cash in hand, so the Hong Kong government loved the cash, so we built a lot of houses. In the middle of it, the policy risk changed. All of a sudden, we built our houses, we could not sell it. I got 1,000 people running around, all the mechanical engineers, civil engineers, doing nothing. So actually, this is at the end of the world. And with 2 things we did. One is, hey, give confidence to yourself. Let's work together to find a new edge of the organization. They built a new culture of their own market segment by creating the building maintenance culture. Think about it. In Asia, a lot of countries did not do well in maintaining their own buildings. Thousands of those. If you just go in and ask for repair services and so on, nobody will listen to you. But you work on creating a new culture, and they come to you right away. So now I need to build another 5 housing societies in Hong Kong alone, and countries like Thailand and so on and mainland coming in and say, well, could you come to my country, help us build another 6 or 7 sizable housing societies. This is the type of situation based on one thing, confidence. Because you have the confidence, you'll be able to work things out. Last but not the least, in terms of Tencent, if you notice this particular organization, within about 2 years, less than 2 years actually, become the largest internet corporation in China, in mainland. Okay? February this year, I spent a lot of time with them trying to help on reviewing certain things, and so I just spent about 4 days with them. And then we did something right probably. At that time, the stock price of this company, Tencent, QQ, that's like an ICQ type of things, cost about $45 per share. That was February this year. Do you know what the price now? 140. So must be something right. Again, creativity. Allow people to do something on their own. Do it if you convince it, if you have the passion, go try it. Organizationally taking the policy that I would support your new ideas to the extent, and that's why they are 140 today. Second, intergenerational workforce. I'm not going to go into more detail, just a couple of points. We are handling and faced with a new breed of employees every day today. Every single bit of the workforce, if you use the HR strategy by profiling of your employees or sub-profiling analysis or even internal demographic analysis, you will notice there are a lot of internal dynamics or dilemmas among the workforce. Age is one, X, Y, Z, whatever you call it, baby boomer. This already been talked about. But do you have situation like, there was one policy of one company lady I just found out. They said that, well, people from America would be able to buy 2 products of the company monthly with a big discount. But then the local can only buy 2 per year. 40% people gone the next month because of that, not because of money, because of the sort of a sense of discrimination. Insensitivity is the problem here. Generation Y, how to describe Generation Y? I run the training program for about 200 trainees, and I've been doing a lot of training for them, and they don't like it, they hate it. They say, well, Eddie, I don't like it, it's old style, and so on. So the other day, I just said, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to set certain location and so on. You guys do it together, create your own training program. And they did. They put up this CSR thing, the corporate social services. They went to Malaysia, and then they bought about 10 kit sets to mount up with bicycles. They did it all by team building and so on, out of their own. And afterwards, everybody know each other so well, and they contributed 10 fixed bicycles to a local NGO. So they feel good, and 90% of them are still around today. It's 3 years now. You understand, in the iBank Junior, they would usually go pretty quickly. This is the way I look at the Gen Y. They love people, they love the animals, birds, and everything, but they just watch their front door. They never look at their back door. You see what happened to the duck, right? The naughty duck. This is a way to look at how to manage Gen Y. You just stay there, watch out, make yourself available when they need you. How to communicate? We talk about communication in our adult world. I tell you, we are outdated already. Look at the young kids, even my sort of a young boy. Actually, they have thousands of ways in communicating. I was saying, well, Daddy is the HR director, 25, 30 years experience. I can read people inside out overnight. I know a lot of people. I know a lot of network. My younger boy said, Daddy, are you sure? I said, yes. I have about 100 people on my Facebook. I know them and so on, and I know this and know that. Daddy, do you know how many names on my Facebook? I said, how many? 800. They said 800 is a below minimum. It's a below average. About 1,002. And I said, I know them. Daddy, how much you know them? I said, I really know them. For example, this is a man, this is a woman, this is a working experience. I said, Daddy, I know how they talk to their parents through the Facebook. I know their secrets with their second girlfriend, not even the first. I know that, they take certain money from certain individual, they cheated in examination, they know everything. Daddy, do you know? I said, I don't. Different world of communication these days. So watch out on this one. You need to respect that. Mindset. I'm not going to get into that one. So if people are talking about adaptive workforce, creative workforce, a couple of things we need to relook at. What do you see? What do you see? Tell me. A submarine plane, right? How do you feel? Where are you when you look at this one? There's no risk to you, right? You must be somewhere. You are definitely not inside the plane, right? So whatever risk, whatever bombs and so on, you're okay, right? How about this one? Where are you? Does it concern you now? Absolutely. When we are talking about policies, human capital, and so on, we can just be talking like a third-party person. Okay? We need to be part of it. That's the way I run the HR organization. That's why people respect you, because you're part of them. When you look at all these scenarios, including the intergenerational thing, you take it to heart. That's where you get your way in to influence people. How about this one? What is this? Pretty good car, right? And what is that stuff? No, we call it the horse car. The Asian terms called horse car. It's just to teach people about the terminology. Education reform. Hong Kong last 10 years, we had a major problem in the workforce. With the GDP around 25,000 US per annum, per capita earning to 30,000 today and so on, people think they are in a very much comfort zone. So people would be excellent problem solver, but not more than that. The problem is, so if I have a DeFi problem, they will fix it like hell. Look at the medical, look at the SARS and so on. If you have a DeFi area, they fix it easily. The problem is the world is not perfect anymore. A lot of the time, we don't have any preceding experience at all. So what are you going to do? So we say, well, we need to do a lot of things. Early on, no. My prestigious speakers just talk about lifelong learning and so on. We have the LLL. That is the lifelong learning, right? We have the PPP, public-private partnership, everything. And here, we do, other than those things, we do one more thing. We said, let's help the workforce, the whole workforce, to have a new understanding of the change management. We are going to break the culture. Instead of everything defined, we are going to create certain burning platform gradually, or else you will come into riot. Gradually, this is a 10 years project of changing the whole education reform. I'm just, no need to worry about it, okay? I just want for that to show there are a lot of thinking, a lot of analysis going into this one. And we believe one thing. Currently, we have the 3 years junior secondary, 2 years senior secondary, 2 years matriculation, and 3 years university. We call it 3-2-2-3. The problem with that one is so only 3 years university education never enough. We'll not be able to match with the high education strategy. So we do this. We change it. We change two things. One is we increase one more year to the university, become 4. We eliminate one public examination so that people have lesser examination to attend. And more than that, instead of 3 core programs like English, Chinese, mathematics, we add the 4. I know that this is a bit unique. We add the liberal studies because the dynamic workforce would be important for the future. So this is the area you cannot have 100% syllabus for people to follow. They need to create their own learning environment and so on. So like this one, old one, new one. All of a sudden, 2 things happen. One is everyone, including the parents, affected. Don't need to learn about it. Teachers, particularly for the liberal studies, no longer there's a defined textbook. They need to create their own textbook, particularly the e-learning. We've been doing that extremely well. We actually cover every aspect of stakeholders and meet with everyone, including the private sector. I, from the private sector, join a lot of the school seminars and so on and so forth to this one. So the liberal studies, we believe, would be their future workforce. That's the spirit. I just jump over here. Here, 2 things as like a summary. The first thing I believe important. We've been doing very well. Korea, Japan, Singapore, other places. Everyone actually today doing pretty well. Actually, the rest of the world actually are pretty envious about Asia through this particular 15 months turmoil because you guys seems to have a lot less impact. So we are okay. The problem is that we are so far so good. As Jim Collins said, being good actually is never enough. The problem we have, good actually is the enemy of great. So we need to relook at, unless you create a greatness, we will not be able to compete. Unless you create a greatness, people will be losing the spirit. That's why two statements here. One is, whatever policy guides and so on, may it be public sector, private sector, government, or even NGO, or professional aspects, right people, we need to make sure we have the right people, identify them, assess them, and then put them in the right bus, right position. Not only that, because the partnership will be the survivor skills for the future, right mix. A lot of people don't attend to this one, right mix. I have one university, I've been as a deputy chairman of the council in Hong Kong, and then we had some management problem. We tried to hire chair professors. I've been putting up a year and a half, I couldn't hire even one. By changing the whole management team, you know what happened? Within 6 months, I hired 15 chair professors worldwide. So again, you get the right mix, you get all the people you need. Second, this is again, how to ensure there's always motivation and extent to do things and make things happen and make things change. Somebody need to help you, inspire you, those inspiration. Inspiration, absolutely critical. People here, actually, you have a role to play to inspire people around you, inspire the government and so on. Once you have done your job, the second phase is the individual will be able to build from within his or her own aspiration. Unless people have aspiration, there will be no desire, no energy. The third thing, once you have the aspiration and there's a gap, there's a desperation. That's the way to go for in approaching the future future world. I hope that this particular summary would be able to give you some real-life cases specifically and a couple of policies experience. And I hope that we'll have some more discussions on this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Eddie Ong, for your very illuminating and interesting and informative presentation. Now, let me turn to the discussion, how they will react to these distinguished presentations. Let me invite Mr. Bernard Hugonia. Are you going to, could you share with us what you think about all this? Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you very much indeed. I'm more ready to answer the question you put at the beginning of the session, that is, what sort of recommendations we could make to policymakers in order to foster future talents, and I would make reference to what has been said in the two presentations. If I take the 5 educational sectors one by one, starting with pre-primary education, early childhood education and care, I would say that a very simple message would be to policymakers to make sure that they are investing in the foundations, that is, a foundation that you do acquire at a very early stage, and therefore you need to have universal free access to early childhood education and care. We have evidence from the program PISA that to achieve high performance you need at least 2 years of early childhood education. Second, concerning primary and secondary education, where more or less you should have universal access in all countries in the world. The main objective should be to look after the quality of teaching. The quality of any educational system cannot be higher than the quality of teaching. And here you have 2 main objectives. The first one is to invest in early education and in-service training to make sure that this is of quality. And second, you have to have more incentives and stimuli and assessment of teachers in order to raise the quality. And as I said in another session, you need to make sure that apart from cognitive skills that need to be acquired in primary and secondary education, you need to invest in generic skills that prepare the young kids for the future, that is, they are equipping young kids with skills for life. Third, vocational education and training, which is getting more and more important nowadays, not only in developed countries, but even more so in developing countries. We have to make sure that a few conditions are met. First of all, that you are not doing the streaming too early, that is not at the age of 10, as it is done in some countries, but more at the age of 13, 14, or 15. And to make sure that you have the appropriate pathways between the technical and professional education on one hand and academic education on the other hand. Again, you need to invest in generic skills so that the kids are not too specialized, and therefore in the future, instead of keeping the same profession, they could change profession, which is certainly a condition of the knowledge society in which we are living nowadays. Higher education, the tendency now in several countries is for a sort of massification of higher education, but in many countries this is done at the expense of quality. Massification means that you have an increasing number of students, but the investments which are made in terms of higher education are not sufficient. There is a drawback, which is lower quality, and therefore this is quite an important objective to keep in mind: higher quality of higher education. Here there are two things that could be done as well. Career guidance. Most of the time students are choosing their higher education studies by default. That is, they don't know exactly what to do, and therefore they go where there are some room left. And the second one is to give more autonomy to higher education institutions, not only in terms of hiring and firing teachers, but also in terms of budget, financing, and curriculum. Finally, concerning continuing education, the education of adults, it is very important to see that for the time being, most of the time, the people benefiting from continuing education are the people who've been benefiting from a good, solid initial education, and the people who are highly skilled. On the contrary, continuing education should profit first and foremost the unemployed and the low-skilled people. Now, if I had to summarize all that in one message, one very simple message to policymakers in order to foster talent, I would say, make sure that you are not putting the emphasis on inputs as far as the educational system is concerned, but on outputs. If you want to raise the quality, if you want to raise the efficiency of educational system, if you want to raise the equity of educational system, make sure that you are focusing more and more on learning outcomes, the quality of learning outcomes, and for that you need to be very well equipped with the appropriate assessment tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hugonia. By the way, Mr. Hugonia, to my knowledge, is one of those who designed this thing called PISA. You know what PISA means? He has pioneered to introduce these very innovative ways of assessing talents or skills across countries. Now, let me invite Professor Geuli. Could you kindly?
Thank you, Chairman. And the topic of our session is future human resource development policies for expansion of national growth potential. So for that purpose, I think Eduardo Vélez suggested we should put emphasis on higher education, and also Eddie Ng put emphasis on three things like enhanced personal effectiveness and intergenerational workforce and educational reform. Let me put more a response to Mr. Vélez's point. I think he put the emphasis on the higher education, and strategic importance of higher education is fully supported, and I fully agree his emphasis, because we are living in a global competitive economies, in knowledge economies, and we try to develop science, technology, and creative thinking to improve our life in the global competitive economies and the knowledge economies. And also for improvement of income and the living standard, for sure, higher education will contribute more for growth potentials of the nation. However, I would like to put in some word of caution on the sequence of a heavy investment in higher education. Because economic resources, budget are limited and should be allocated very strategically. We are not living in an unlimited supply of resources. In the government or enterprises or our household, all are constrained by the resources. So we have to have some strategy for priority in investment. Priority government investment in higher education should be determined by the development stage and the strategy, development strategy. In general, government heavy and the priority investment in higher education should be made after heavy investment and development of basic and secondary education. I think at this point is, I think, in agreement with Mr. Hugonier's comment also. If we don't do that, heavy investment in higher education will result in inadequate supply of human resources demanded by the economy, and it will result in inequity among people. And we cannot attain the Millennium Development Goals. Because most of the Millennium Development Goals emphasize the basic education and up to grade 9. I reproduced a table which he showed, but it was not very well shown, but I'm trying to show this is in 1960, and this is 2005. In the 1962, Korea's per capita income was $87. And Mexico at that time has almost $3,000 per capita income. But in year 2005, the Korea has attained very close to $14,000 per capita, and Mexico remains still around $60,000. So why this income per capita income difference came? A lot of economists try to find out the source of the difference. And then the World Bank and some KDI the authors found out the main difference here, if you say the whole difference, main difference, this much is only difference in output due to growth in the labor and the capital. But the rest of a large portion, 2/3 of the difference between Mexico and Korea's per capita income difference is due to technology and also accumulation of knowledge, total factor productivity difference. So Korea's fast growth may owe to Korea's fast growth of total factor productivity and knowledge accumulation than to Korea's, oh, I'm sorry, this one. Okay, Korea's fast growth may owe to Korea's fast growth of total factor productivity and the knowledge accumulation than to Korea's growth of capital and labor. But the fast growth of Korea's total factor productivity and the knowledge accumulation may be due to educational investment, because education investment will promote productivity and the knowledge accumulation. Since education's contributions to the GDP growth were confirmed by many econometric studies. I summarized some studies made here since 1968 and then 1989, and then later, very recently, Harvard and KDI also made a study. So if we look at all these studies during 1960s and then 1989, most studies indicated that on average, about 8% of the GDP per capita growth was due to education. So we can think, oh, Korea must have invested a lot on education compared to Mexico, for example, or some other countries. However, the size of Korea's educational investment is not the cause, since Korean government per capita investment in education as a percentage of GDP was smaller than in Mexico. Not only the Mexico, but I compared 62 countries whose per capita income was below $300 in the 1960s, from 1962 until 1970. Because Korea per capita income became $300 only in 1972. So I compared all 62 countries which were below per capita income of $300, and their education investment was greater than Korea's education investment. As you can see here, the comparator I used is between 50 and 60s. Comparator countries' average rate of investment as a percentage of education investment, as percentage of GDP, was throughout 1965 to 2005, it was higher than Korea. Korea's average was 3.4% of GDP was spent on education by the government. But all other comparator countries, they spent 3.7% of their GDP on education. Not only that, Mexico, they spent 3.9% of their GDP on education. Therefore, we cannot claim Korea invested more of its GDP on education because other countries spend more of their GDP in education. Then what is the source of a higher total factor productivity and the knowledge accumulation in Korea? My argument is, first, fast growth of Korea's per capita GDP may be due to the way, the sequence that Korean government allocated the educational expenditures. In early years, in the 1950s, Korean government spent heavily in primary education. By law, government has to spend 13% of its resources, budget, in education. And later, in the 1960s and 70s, they emphasized secondary education. They spend more heavily on secondary education. And finally, since the 1980s, they spend heavily on higher education. If we compare this one with Mexico, Mexican government's educational expenditure favored secondary education and higher education, especially higher education. Most of the time in the 1960s, in the 1980s, Mexico government placed a heavy emphasis on higher education. Only in the 1990s, they start spending on primary education. So I show you government expenditures at different levels of education. And out of a total government education expenditure, 100%, how much they spend on primary education and secondary education and higher education. Is a dotted line is Korea, and the solid line is Mexico. And the starting point is 1960 until 2005. You can see Korea spend more on higher primary education than Mexico, and then more on the secondary education than Mexico. Initially, they spend here more than Korea, and also in a higher education, Mexico, throughout the whole period, spent a greater proportion of education budget on higher education. So the sequence of the different government educational expenditure strategies between Mexico and Korea was the main source of difference in the accumulation of knowledge and also total productivity. Faster educational development at all levels, including higher education in Korea than in Mexico. As a result, more equitable income distribution in Korea, and earlier satisfaction of Millennium Development Goals in Korea, and the faster economic and the social development in Korea than in Mexico, although it started at a much lower level than in Mexico. So if you look at the enrollment rate and the primary education, and secondary education, and higher education, and the primary education, Korea has achieved universal primary education in the 1950s. And then through 1960s, and then it has put in 1960s, 70s, it placed emphasis. It grew very sharply here. Higher education started in 1980, and especially in 1985, and then it soared up. That's enrollment rate. And then because of their sequence and strategy, even now, Korea enrollment rate, higher education, is higher than the United States. And in 2005, we have attained 87% of relevant age group students are in the higher education. So to have higher growth in the national growth potential, I think we have to, all other developing countries as well as developed countries should pay attention to the sequence of investment. And my second message is, I think government economic development policy and education development policy should be aligned, consistent. Because during 1960 and 1999, the Korean government's educational development policies consistently supported national economic and social development strategy. It's not the other way around. National economic development strategy was supported by the education development strategy. So in other words, education development strategy was trying to satisfy the demand generated by the national economic development strategy. It's a more demand-driven education development strategy. Someone may say that's not right. Education is a higher level than the economic life because we are seeking metaphysical level through education. But I think many educators may argue for that, but they may be right. But we are not discussing the metaphysical world. We are discussing enhancing or expansion of national growth potential. For that purpose, what role education should play? That is the topic of today. So for that purpose, education should be trying to meet the demand generated by socio-economic development strategies. In the 1960s and 1950s, in the case of Korea, they tried to develop meet the manpower need of agricultural societies. And that's why they had primary education emphasis in the education policies. But in the 1960s and 70s, the Korean government tried to have economic development policy through labor-intensive light industries and the chemical and heavy industries in the 1970s. Okay. So here, education policy put emphasis on the universal secondary education, especially vocational technical education. And in the 1980s, the economic development strategy placed more emphasis on technology-intensive and the knowledge-based economy and society. Therefore, education policy placed more emphasis on higher education expansions. Recently, however, there have been no clear government economic social development strategies and policies. Therefore, government's education development strategy and policies are at a loss. We are trying to groping in the dark because economic development strategy was not very clearly defined. So we need a compass or a guiding light for the future economic and the social development strategy. And then we have to formulate responsive educational strategies and policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for sharing us with your thoughts on education and development in Korea, and also your excellent analysis of two countries, Mexico and Korea. It seems as if you went back to your old World Bank days. Very good analysis. Thank you very much for that. Now, let me invite Bakani from Philippines. Can you share us your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My reaction will be in the form of presenting a development country perspective on this issue of ensuring that there's a right policy mix to ensure that human talents are able to provide a major contribution to national growth. And I will be discussing the Philippine experience in the hope that I will be able to draw lessons from this. Well, some facts about the Philippines. We have a population of more than 90 million. We have a very young population, more than half, 53%, belong to the 0 to 24 age group. And that's why the education sector really feels the brunt of this very young population. This is a result of the continuing rapid population growth rate. The population growth rate stands at about 2% annually. This is already a reduction from the 3% annual population growth rate that was experienced in the 1960s and the 1970s. Being a developing country characterized by scarce capital, we look to human resources as the most valuable asset for promoting national growth. And education is believed to be a very major instrument for developing human capital. We have a very extensive school system from the primary to the tertiary education level. The private sector is very active at the tertiary education level, accounting for about 80% of enrollment. There is very high school participation. The total enrollment at present is about 24 million students, which represent about 50% of the 0 to 24 population age group. There's a very high social demand for education. Filipinos, families look to education as a great equalizer since it opens up many opportunities. On the average, a typical Filipino has 12 years of education. With all of these positive factors, one would think that everything is well with the education sector and the Philippine economy. But what is the present situation? We have many college graduates who are unemployed. The estimate is about 700 to 800,000 college graduates are unemployed. In contrast, there is a demand for middle-level manpower, which cannot be met. An example is in the call center industry. Only 5% of those who apply for jobs in the call center industry are accepted. The major reason behind this present situation in the Philippines is the mismatch between the output of the educational system and the labor market. This has been compounded by the slow growth of the Philippine economy. The Philippines has lagged behind its Southeast Asian neighbors. We have not registered any double-digit economic growth. That's why there has been a very slow growth in employment generation. One would tend to think that there's a lot of wasted talents in the sense that we are unable to maximize the contribution of our human resources to national growth. Fortunately, there is also a bright light to this. We have what we refer to as overseas Filipino workers. We have 7 to 8 million Filipinos overseas who have penetrated the international labor market. And I would like to think that the two reasons behind this is that Filipinos have the ability to speak English. And another important characteristic is that Filipinos are generally believed to be adaptable to different environments and different cultures. We have different skill levels among the Filipinos abroad. For instance, we have highly trained professionals like medical doctors, nurses, and other health professionals who are found in the US and in Europe and other parts of the world. We have IT professionals, for instance, in Singapore, hotel managers in China. We have engineers. We have maritime personnel. The estimate is that 30% of the maritime personnel in foreign ships are Filipinos. We also have construction workers in Korea, as well as domestic helpers and caregivers in parts of Asia. So the overseas Filipinos make a very important contribution to the economy. The estimated remittances of overseas Filipinos is about $15 billion, which account for about 10% of the country's gross national product. And it is believed that it is these remittances from overseas Filipinos which have somehow kept the economy afloat during the economic crisis in Asia during the late 1990s and in the current global crisis. So we can see that indirectly overseas Filipinos are contributing to national growth as well as the growth of other countries where these overseas Filipinos are working. Some of the policies which have led to this present situation in the Philippines is that there is this social bias against technical vocational education, which was created by the administration of this, the National Collegiate Entrance Examination. This was administered in the 1970s up to the early 1990s to be able to regulate the entry to the college degree programs. Those who fail to meet the cutoff can only take up technical vocational courses. Therefore, there is this stigma attached to students in technical and vocational education. Also, Filipino families tend to favor white-collar jobs for their children, regardless of the employment prospects. Another reason is that despite the very active private tertiary education sector in the Philippines, there continues to be a proliferation of public tertiary institutions. State universities and colleges are created by legislation, and very often a politician would want to have a public tertiary institution established in his district or province as his permanent achievement or legacy. More recently, there is this phenomenon of local government units setting up local community colleges. And for instance, in the Metro Manila area alone, most of the local government units, the cities, have set up their own public tertiary institutions. And if we look at the enrollment trend in these public tertiary institutions, the enrollment is mostly in the soft courses, and there are very few enrollees in the science and technology courses. Also, because of the capital investments required for the science and technology courses, only very few public tertiary institutions offer specializations along this line. An important effect of this expansion in the public tertiary education sector is that it has drawn away resources from basic education. We have to remember that primary and basic education is the mandate of the government, and therefore whatever scarce government resources are available should be provided to this to the primary and secondary education sector. Unfortunately, there is also a very significant underinvestment in education. The figures show that about 2.8% of GNP is allocated to education, and 15% of the national budget is allocated to education. And in the case of the Philippines, we have to remember that a sizable portion of the national budget is allocated for servicing debt. There was even a time when the debt service burden accounted for about 40% of the national budget. So the pie is very limited, and yet the share of education in that pie is also very small. This has resulted in shortages in basic resources like classrooms, teachers, textbooks. Also especially in the 1960s and 70s, because of this underinvestment in education, the status of the teaching profession greatly deteriorated. It is said that before the Second World War, only the best talents from high school went into teaching, but in the past few decades, we have observed that those who entered the teacher education programs come from the lower half of the high school graduates. The underinvestment in education has led to the decline in quality at all levels, and this is borne out by both national and international tests. So some of the policy reforms which have been introduced at the tertiary level, there is now a greater industry-academic linkages. For instance, in the Commission on Higher Education, we have technical panels wherein representatives from industry, from the professional association, and the academics decide on the changes in the curriculum. In the technical vocational education sector, we are expanding the dual training programs. And in the secondary education level, we are strengthening the technical vocational component in the secondary education curriculum so that as early as high school, we are able to interest students to look at career options in the tech voc area, since this definitely offer attractive employment and income opportunities. Then directly related to the presentations earlier, in the area of private tertiary education, the current policy right now is the regulation, since you would want to promote autonomy and competition among private tertiary institutions. We have to take advantage of the responsiveness and the flexibility of private institutions to be able to adapt to changes in environment and to be able to respond to market signals. When we discuss with private school administrators, very often their advice is for government to leave them alone or to level the playing field, in the sense that government should not impose on private tertiary education institutions certain rules or regulations which government cannot impose on state tertiary institutions. So in brief, this is the Philippine experience, the problems that we have encountered in the area of tertiary education, and some of the policy reforms which are intended to address the problems experienced in the past. And I would like to support the earlier suggestion about student assessment systems. For instance, in the Philippines, we have a very strong professionalized censure examination system for which examinations are administered in the different professions like engineering, medicine, accountancy, and I think this will certainly be a way of assessing the final outputs of the tertiary education institutions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bakani, for sharing the case from Philippines. I'm sorry to ask you to shorten your presentation or remark. Unfortunately, we have less than 10 minutes left, but within the next 10 minutes, I would like to see some reactions from the floor. I may take a couple of questions and remarks from the floor and then give floor to the panelists. Who would like to go first? Tell us who you are and then give us a very short question or remark. Please raise your hand. Okay. Dr. Bang?
I'm Bang Myung-suk from Caris, Korea. My comment and question goes to Dr. Hugo Nier. Thank you very much for your creation of PISA study, and it has been very favorable to Korea. Question: you mentioned that quality teaching comes first to produce quality learning. I understand the PISA study has been prosperous, and so many countries are trying to involve in the study to get international standard. My question is, I wonder if you have ever thought about assessment on quality teaching. If you have not, could you share your thought why? Thank you.
Dr. Bang, who's next? Raise your hand. Okay, many.
I had a question about the recommendation on early child development, which I agree to Professor Ugonier that this has very high returns. All the research shows that. My question is, why in East Asia don't we see yet that early child development programs are preschool programs are so popular? Because very few countries, in fact, have them. Compared even to Latin America, for example, and how do we get countries to take this up? And I was just going to ask my fellow countryman, Undersecretary Bakani, what he thought of the two recommendations from the two commentators. One, should the Philippines be emphasizing early child development? Secondly, given Professor Lee's recommendation for a phased approach to development of the education system, whether early child or preschool should in fact be a priority over even any investments in higher education in the Philippines, given its stage of development.
Thank you, Manny. The last question. I may take two questions. Okay, lady first.
I want to ask a question to Mr. Eddy. Your theory about adding common sense to current educational system was interesting. But for me, the theme is still a little bit ambiguous. So could you give us a more specific explanation on your thoughts about teaching common sense in school? Thank you.
Thank you. Director, you have a question. Okay, the final question or remark.
My name is Ryu Hae-suk from Korean Ministry of Education, Science and Technology. Thank you for your joining our forum. I have a question to Dr. Ugonier. As you may know, Korean government has been implementing restructuring of universities. We are trying to reduce number of colleges in terms of quality control. Many people talk about over-education in Korea. As presented Professor Lee, Korea has almost the highest enrollment rate in higher education. I'm wondering if you and OECD agree with the terminology of over-education in knowledge-based society. If then, would you please give us any comments or advice on over-education in Korea, please?
Thank you for the question. Now, it looks that OECD is more popular than World Bank. What I will do is I'll ask Ms. Dr. Ugonier to respond in 3 minutes, and also I'll invite Eduardo to share the perspective from World Bank in 2 minutes. How does that sound? Is it okay? Dr. Ugonier, you.
Thank you. So I have 3 questions, 1 minute for each question. The first one is concerning the assessment of quality teacher. Why don't we develop a PISA for teachers? Well, the question is it possible to assess the skills of teachers? We can certainly assess their knowledge, but can we assess their pedagogical methods? That's a different question. And the answer that we come to for the time being is no, we cannot really assess. Second, that you can expect a very strong resistance from the part of teachers if you were to try to measure what they call their productivity. They hate this word, productivity of teachers. You can talk about productivity for the industrial sector, but certainly not for the educational sector. What we've done is to survey teachers, to ask them about their career prospect, their initial education, their continuing education, their motivation, and so on and so forth. This program is called TALIS, and it's been, the results have been issued in June this year. So you may refer to that work, TALIS, T-A-L-I-S. The second question is concerning early childhood education and care. Why is it so important? As I said, we have evidence from PISA that countries where students can benefit from at least 2 years of education, of pre-primary education, they have a better chance to do well in PISA. How to go about if you don't have any early childhood education and care in countries? That's a difficult question. In many countries where you don't have a public sector, you have a private sector, and this is creating some inequity problems, that's for sure. So what we are advocating is that the education and care for young children should be free and universal. The point could be made that if you consider that education is first and foremost a public good, and if you consider that pre-primary education is where you are getting the best foundations for your life, for skills for life, well, in that case, you have a good point to declare that early childhood education and care should be a free public good for all, and therefore should be universal and free, offered by the public sector. Now, the last question about is there some sort of over-education in Korea? Well, according to the research we've seen, would it be for the economy, for instance, and the growth of this country during the past 30 years, I wouldn't tend to think that there is some over-education. There might be another problem in Korea, which is the over-competition that you have between students, between teachers, and between schools. And certainly this can explain somehow some part of the success of this country in PISA. But I don't think that you are over-educated. On the contrary, this is fine. Keep going.
Thank you, Dr. Hugonia. Eduardo, do you have some remark?
2 comments. I totally agree with Kibo about the importance of sequencing in the investment in education. And I wanted to mention that yesterday I attended a session where one participant told the following story. In Paris, a couple of months ago, a colleague of ours in the bank was presenting his book on world-class university. And after his presentation, somebody from the audience asked him to give a specific example of what was really a good university. And the author of the study said, think about soccer, think about football. A good university is like Barcelona or Real Madrid or Manchester United. And this person telling the story said, no, I believe the good university is equivalent to the football team in my little village, because they are the beginning, they are the ones that start the process. I'm telling you this story for you not to make a mistake. I believe the good university is equivalent to Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Manchester United.
Thank you, Eduardo. I suspect this very gentleman is from UNESCO by the name of George Haddad. Well, I think I need to do justice to other speakers in this, because if you have any remark or any point to share, can you do it just in 1 minute? Yeah, perfect.
Mr. Chairman, just want to answer this question. Question is, adding the common sense as one of the criteria for future workforce, would that be a little bit vague? It was a bit vague until last 5 years, a lot of the multinational corps, we look at their businesses, why they are not growing, why they are withdrawing and sandbagging. We find out that the sense of, the common sense, the sense of learning become critical. So one company like Citi, after the big blow of the business, create a new way of addressing the workforce. Let me share with you the 3E. The 3E meaning education, experience, exposure. On this ground, there's no define of the content or functional specialty, but rather the ability to be independently learning and adapting and building life of his own, with his own independent opinion. That's what the common sense is all about. Another reason for this on a business case basis, Mr. Chairman, is that nobody can predict what's going to happen. That's the problem. You might think that, well, this is Korea, this is East Asia. The problem is that going forward, if you believe, you know what, the megatrend Asia, megatrend da-da-da, and so on, you would see that the division of labor by boundary, by functional, getting blurred. A lot of the higher education universities are now moving towards another direction. That is multidisciplinary. You will see double degree, you will see triple degree for the reason of sustainability of learning and sustainability of employability. So these are a couple of things about the common sense issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ang. I'm sorry, I didn't recognize that you had the question. Thank you. Any other comments, just briefly?
There was a question from Manny. The question about early childhood education, and certainly in the Philippines, early childhood education is among the government's priorities. One, because we know that we'd like to introduce a mental stimulus as early as possible. And secondly, we believe that this will have a significant contribution to reducing the dropout rate during the first 3 years of elementary education. We lose about 25% of those who start out in grade 1 during the first 3 years of primary education. And we believe that if children are exposed to early childhood education, then they have better chances of staying on up to the end of the elementary or even the secondary education cycle. Then the second question, I think the Korean experience would be very useful to the Philippines. For instance, there is a similarity in the sense that in the tertiary education sector, the private sector is very active, and therefore, I guess in the Philippines, the government should minimize any direct public investments in tertiary education and use whatever government resources are available to provide primary and secondary education, especially with the continuing population growth rate that we have. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Undersecretary Bakani. Professor Lee, you have any comment?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Well, it has been a long day, but I'm in no position to summarize any of the debate, which was very rich in terms of depth and the areas that we covered. But if I may share a couple of points that my own thoughts on this issue of preparing future generation. Well, from the debate, it seems very clear that we need to strengthen the education sector to better prepare ourselves for the future in terms of maximizing the potential for national and individual growth. It's very obvious. Perhaps we may emphasize the role of higher education further because it's at the very top of education ladder and because higher education is closer to the society and the market. The number two, in so doing, we may rethink the way we allocate resources to different levels of education, different activities of education. And also, perhaps we may think about resource allocation from a longer-term perspective. How do we allocate resources at different points in time? The size of investment matters, but also the way we distribute resources to different education activities may matter as well. Finally, we need to think about the outcome rather than the input in doing all these things. Like Dr. Hugonius pointed out, we need to drive the results and outcome rather than inputs and process, because what matters is the kind of skills and competence that are useful and relevant in the future globalized society. It's been a very long day again. Thank you very much again for joining us for this important session. Please, ladies and gentlemen, please join me thanking the speakers and discussants. So let's end here. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you very much indeed.